My name is Dr. Anne Marie Vandersanden. I'm a professor of horticulture at Iowa State University. Welcome to the online garden design course. The module I will be presenting is titled Applying Landscape Design Principles. In this presentation, I will discuss the 6 common landscape design principles. These principles are simplicity, order or design framework, repetition, balance, scale and proportion, and emphasis. I like to organize the design principles into 2 different categories based loosely on how they influence the landscape. The first group are those principles that influence how the landscape looks. This group includes simplicity, balance, proportion and scale, and emphasis. The second group influence how the landscape is organized, and this group includes order or design framework and repetition. Although I've grouped these into 2 categories, the reality is that there is a lot of overlap between the 2 of them and two groups, and they really do impact each other. The first principle I will discuss is simplicity. I think this is one of the easiest principles to identify in a landscape. Simplicity can be divided into 2 categories: physical simplicity and visual simplicity. Physical simplicity is evident when the shapes within the garden are simple. For example, the top image on the slide has a simple circle lawn and square stepping stones. The bottom image also has a simple and gently curving bedline. Visual simplicity relates to how the landscape looks, and it is often reinforced by physical simplicity. In visual simplicity, plants are grouped or massed rather than lined up as individual entities. You can see examples of plant masses in the bottom image on the slide. Further examples of visual simplicity can come from uniform paving materials, simple and natural plant forms, and repetition of plants and colors. I think the captions speak for themselves in this slide. The second principle is order or design framework. When this principle is implemented well, it gives the landscape an overall framework where individual elements such as a patio, planting beds, water feature, etc. can all be added. The principle helps the overall landscape make sense. Order or design framework is often linked to the overarching theme that a landscape has, such as formal, informal, or a hybrid structured informality look and feel. I'll talk more about these in just a moment. The principle also helps define rooms within a landscape, such as a backyard entertaining area. It also helps make a physical link between the landscape and the house. The blue arrows on the slide's image show how the designer aligned the corner of the patio space with the corner of the house, creating a connection between the 2 elements. The 3 images here represent 3 different frameworks: formal, informal, and structured informal, which is a blend of the first 2. A formal design often includes symmetrical balance, where a landscape can be divided in half along a central axis, and each side of the landscape is a mirror image. They are also mostly linear in layout. Informal designs tend to have asymmetrical balance. In this case, if the landscape were divided in half, there wouldn't be a mirror image on either side of the axis, but there would be a similar amount of visual weight on either side of the axis. I will talk more about this in the section on balance in just a few slides. Structured formal is a combination of both frameworks and tends to take on many different looks. To illustrate those different looks, this image has been included. It shows a design that has structured informality. There are some linear elements, but not mirror symmetry. This is probably my favorite design framework to create. The principle of repetition can be very obvious, or in other cases, it can be more subtle. Repetition gives a landscape continuity by having various elements repeated multiple times throughout the design. Examples of these elements include plants, colors, textures, and hardscape material. The image on the slide has a number of examples of repetition based on a pyramidal shape. Examples include the pyramidal shape of the evergreen shrubs in the background, the shape of the hydrangea flowers in the midground, the shape of the ornamental grass flowers in the foreground, and the shape of the obelisk structure in the middle of the image. Repetition is also seen through the limited color scheme of just green and white. Repetition doesn't have to be monotonous. The illustration on the left shows a central axis with small rectangles repeated at set distances along the length of it. This is pretty monotonous. The image on the right shows repetition with just a little bit of variation. In this case, the alternating pattern of rectangles and half circles are repeated rather than just the rectangles. This type of repetition gives a little more visual interest. Balance is the fourth principle. I've already referred to it when I discussed order or design framework. Symmetrical balance is characterized by a central axis along which a landscape can be divided visually. The sides on either side of the axis are a mirror image of each other. And although symmetrical balance is often associated with landscapes that have a lot of linear or straight elements, it can be applied to any landscape. The two black lines on this image represent two different central axes in this design. Take a few minutes and look at how the design mirrors itself from one side to the other. The other type of balance found in landscapes is asymmetrical. In this case, there is no obvious central axis. Asymmetrical designs also tend to be more informal in their overall feel and are often characterized by curvilinear planting beds. These line drawings illustrate a front entry planting with a symmetrical layout, the top image, and an asymmetrical layout in the bottom image. Although the plantings are not the same on each side of the front door, there is still a similar visual balance on either side of the central axis, created by that front door. Scale and proportion is the fifth design principle. This principle takes into account the size relationships between the many different landscape features. Common relationships to consider include plants to buildings, plants to other plants, and plants to people. When designing a landscape, it's important to consider the mature size of the plants. Although the proportion may be a little off-kilter the first few years, once the plants reach a mature size, the relationships should be appropriate. This example of a landscape at Versailles shows how important it is to consider the overall size and dimensions of the landscape. Although the evergreen shrubs themselves aren't particularly large in the image on the left, the overall landscape area they are planted in is, so the scale works with the massive size of the palace. The image on the right is one of many water features at Versailles, and it illustrates the large scale of it relative to the visitors. Clearly, a small backyard pond wouldn't work in this landscape context. The final design principle is emphasis. Emphasis is created by carefully situated focal points. It is appropriate to include multiple focal points in a single landscape, since the entire landscape is usually not viewed from just one vantage point. It's important to situate them in different locations based on where the landscape is viewed from the most. All of the images on this slide provide examples of different focal points that provide emphasis. This brings me to the conclusion of this presentation on applying landscape design principles. In summary, this presentation has described each of the 6 landscape design principles, including simplicity, order or design framework, repetition, balance, scale and proportion, and emphasis. I've described a number of ways each principle can be seen in a design and how all the principles work to provide a framework for effective design. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on applying the landscape design principles as part of the Iowa State University Department of Horticulture online garden design course.